So we're going to talk about what population means in terms of statistical data. So if you look up population in the dictionary, it means the number of living things that live in the same place. So we use the word population very commonly. For example, what is the population of Victoria? But in statistics, population has a bit of a different meaning. And it means any complete group with one characteristic in common. So it doesn't necessarily mean a group of humans. It could be a group of animals or a group of businesses or a group of buildings or, again, people, which is what we normally talk about when we talk about population. So it has a bigger meaning than just the number of living things that live in the same place. And we'll be going to be using that new definition as we move through this unit. So before you study a topic, it's really important that you clearly define the population before you start. So let's do this by example. If you wanted to, for example, study the mobile phone habits of teens, you want to learn a little bit more about that, then who are you going to study? That's called the population. And if you imagine that the population, since we're talking about teens, are all the teens in the world, that's a very large population. Be very hard to conduct that study. So if we narrow it down a little bit and say, all right, we want to talk about all Canadian teens, that's what we want to learn about. That makes it a little bit easier. Or we could narrow it down, the focus down a little bit more and say all of the teens in my school. So notice that all three of these are different populations. They are all teens, and we're going to be studying how they, what their phone habits are, but the population is quite different in all three. And so it's really important that it needs to be clearly identified before you start any survey or any statistical process. So let's go back to this cell phone habits of Canadian teens, and we decide that we want to study all Canadian teens between the ages of 13 and 19. So we're very specific, and if we were to measure every unit, that means in this case every teen in that population, it would be called a census. So if it was possible to ask every Canadian teen about their cell phone habits, that would be called a census. Now, the cons of trying to conduct that survey, I think it might be pretty obvious. It's going to be impossible to talk to every teen. So, and if it's very difficult to reach a large population, it would be expensive, and it would take too much time. And because of both of these two factors, the expense and the time, it makes it impossible. Now, if you could do that, if you could survey every single teen, the pros of doing that is that you would have a very true representation of the population. Your census or your survey would tell you exactly what Canadian teens do or do not do with their phones. So that's the pro. So a population is everybody that you want to study for a certain topic. So let's say you want to study everybody that lives on your street. And this is a picture of everybody that lives on your street. So that entire group is called the population. And you could study them by asking every single one, and that would be called a census. Asking every single one of them. Now, because that's usually very time consuming, and if you're doing that on a larger scale, very expensive, instead you randomly select a couple of people on your street and ask them the questions instead. And so let's say you choose this guy and this person and this person. And you say, all right, instead of asking everybody, I'm just going to ask those 4. This is called a sample. Here are your 4 guys, and you have just created a sample, and that is just a selection from the population. And it is a good sample if it is random, and if it is a good representation of the population, entire population. So what does that mean? Well, if I take a look at the sample I have here, it looks like I've got four boys or 4 males. But there are women in the population, and they're not represented in my sample. So this would actually be a poor sample because it does not represent the entire population. There should be an equal mix of women and men, and there should also be all kinds of age groups because we've got older people in the group and we've got younger people in the group. So there should be, in my sample, there should be a mix, just like there is a mix in the population. So if you choose a good sample, it should be a good representation of the entire population. And the pros of using a sample instead of a census is that it is more time effective because you're only asking the survey questions from a smaller group of people. It is also less expensive. Now, the cons is that if your sample is poor, it might not represent the population. So what that means is that if you ask a question of these 4, it might not be the same answer that all of these guys would have gotten. And so if they say, hey, we love to have loud music and parties in our apartment block, but they don't represent they aren't a good representation of the population, then the answer to your survey question is going to be invalid and give you less information. The survey is not going to be as useful.